Okay, so welcome again, everyone. Thanks a lot for coming. And thank you, Jenann Ismael, for accepting my invitation. It's been quite some time that I tried to invite you for a talk. Finally, we managed to. So it's really a pleasure to have you here. So she's going to talk about self-reference, totality, and time. So Jenann, for those who don't know her, maybe physicists might not, philosophers, I'm sure they know her. She's a professor of philosophy at Columbia University. She mainly worked on philosophy of physics, philosophy of science, a bit of philosophy of time. So yeah, Jenann, whenever you want.
Okay, thank you. Thanks so much for having me. Of course, I'd much rather be with you, but I'm delighted to be here. So thank you, Christian. So I'm just going to sort of launch in because it's long, but any attempt to describe the, let me just make sure. Any attempt to describe the universe as a totality will inevitably involve self-reference. And this isn't something that one often confronts in physics. So most day-to-day physics is modeling other systems, so cells, gases. But we maintain this sort of provisional separation. And because of that, we maintain this provisional separation of subject, ourselves, and object, or of investigator and system being investigated. Cosmology is the physics of totality, so you might think that it would arise there, but it's customary in cosmology to maintain this sort of imaginative fiction that we're outside the universe looking down. Ultimately, though, we are part of the universe, we exist, and that means that however we regiment the universe, so whatever regime we work in, if we aim for a theory of the universe as a whole, self-reference will be unavoidable. It's not going to matter in some contexts, but it will matter in some. So the people that have unavoidably encountered it, interestingly, are people who, for example, are trying to program an AGI, an artificial general intelligence in a robot that is an embedded agent. They want to program a system with a bunch of general knowledge and the ability to model the world. And they're coming up against the fact that there are going to be problems of self-reference. And the problems arise because some of what happens that falls under the domain of the system's representational scope is stuff that the system itself, the computer in this case, does. So let me give you a simple example. Suppose that you want to program a computer. It's just a simple little device, and it's going to be our sort of grand overarching database or repository of information about everything. So we set about programming it with as much factual knowledge as we can about the world. We give it laws of physics, and we give it all of the scientific knowledge we've amassed. So facts about the monkeys of Costa Rica and the vast reaches of space. There's an input channel where we can feed it questions and an output channel where the answers appear. And the goal is to be able to put any question of physical fact to it and have it deliver an answer. So, but it's not hard to find a question that it can't answer truthfully. Just ask it, is the answer to this question that's about to appear, is the answer to this question that's about to be displayed in the output channel? No. So it can't answer truthfully. Whichever way it answers, it's going to be giving a false answer. Now, this might seem like a little logical glitch. These kinds of problems are familiar to philosophers and certainly to computer scientists. And the problem is that whatever the computer does in giving the answer to the question is going to interfere negatively with what it says. Computer scientists know, of course, that self-reference leads to paradox. And we don't want to build the potential for paradox into an artificial general intelligence. So the first reaction is to try to suppress it or to keep these sorts of questions from arising at all. But that's much more subtle to accomplish than you think, since there's nothing wrong with the question that's being asked. It's a perfectly ordinary kind of factual question. And any other system, any other computer could answer that truthfully. And indeed, it could itself answer truthfully at any other time. Another thing to do is to acknowledge the difficulty and to try to quarantine it. And again, this is more difficult than you think. If the word no appearing on my screen or in the output channel at some time t is going to affect the truth values of other propositions. So maybe other computers in the room that are also trying to represent the world are going to record my answer. What do I do if I try to quarantine it? Do I withhold truth values from propositions about what they record? And of course, the more connected it is in the whole web of propositions, the more complicated that's going to be. Okay. And in any case, truth value gaps just aren't the kinds of things that we want to introduce into a logical system. Okay. But whatever you do about it, self-reference is usually thought of as a pathology. So the idea is that you want to get as close to minimizing any disturbances. Sorry, I don't know how to stop that. You want to get as close to minimizing any disturbances that the computer's own activity has on the truth values of sentences in the field that it's representing. Okay? And the reason that it arises is clear. It is that by saying things, the computer is also doing things. Okay? It's actually making true certain of the propositions in the web of belief. And we can get that kind of interference between what it says and what it does. And that's just an artifact of the fact that it falls under its own representational scope. If the interference is negative, if what it says conflicts with what it does, that keeps it from being able to stabilize the facts that it's representing independently of what it says about them. Okay? That's what's going on with the paradoxes of self-reference. One can't stabilize the fact that the answer is meant to describe, in this case, the word that appears on the screen or in the output channel, independently of giving the answer, and the thing is set up precisely so that no matter which answer it gives, it's going to be doing something that conflicts with what it says. So negative interference can arise in other ways. So suppose I offer you a $10,000 bet for $1 to predict the output of a simple deterministic switch that will go up or down depending on the input. The glitch is that the input is going to be your prediction, and how the thing is set up is that how the device works is it does the opposite of what's predicted. Okay, you shouldn't take that bet. Now, positive interference can arise too. So a positive interaction effect is a self-fulfilling prophecy. So a man's insecurity about keeping his commitment-shy lover drives her away. A favorable prediction by an influential stock analyst drives prices higher. Any system that's acting in the domain that it's representing is going to encounter interaction effects. And they can interfere in complicated ways, the sorts of ways that we were discovering, with trying to quarantine them for programming and artificial general intelligence. It's going to interfere with pure knowledge acquisition. Okay? If you're lucky, you can quarantine them, but the more connected things are, the more difficult they will be. This stuff is messy. It interferes with what we're trying to do, when what we're trying to do is just get a clean understanding of the intrinsic structure of some domain. We ignore it for good reasons when we're doing physics, but it arises naturally and inevitably as a result, indeed, of the physics of the system, for a system that's part of the domain that it's representing. This isn't a problem, I think. It's a solution to a problem. Because what I'm going to suggest, what I'm going to suggest is that it helps us to understand something that's otherwise very difficult to understand. It's the final piece in a very complicated puzzle in understanding our relationship to time. Okay. So I'm going to start with some remarks from Penrose back in a sort of very beautiful early paper called Singularities and Time Asymmetry, and try to show how this simple logical point set against the right physical backdrop can help us understand something that I think he put quite nicely there, but I think that we all recognize. So here's what he says. the arrow most difficult to comprehend is, ironically, that which is most immediate to experience, namely the feeling of relentless forward temporal progression, according to which potentialities seem to be transformed into actualities. Sorry. So we tend to overgeneralize this sort of becoming, and to think that the universe as a whole, and I mean in our kind of ordinary everyday life, and to think that the universe as a whole is a single synchronous process of coming into being. Now, relativity does rule that out, but it doesn't rule out the idea that temporal progression for an individual system that is actively producing its future is properly understood as a transition from potentiality into actuality. Relativity just means that there's going to be some asynchrony between the world lines of creatures at some distance from one another. So what I'm going to suggest is that when we see how self-reference plays out against the backdrop of a thermodynamic gradient, this makes sense. We just have to take very seriously that we're part of the world and that we're acting in a setting with a thermodynamic gradient. So there are lots of unanswered questions, of course, in both principle and detail about how the various arrows of time line up in physics. I'm going to assume that we have those contours in place, just because I'm not going to address them here. I'll assume that the classical laws, the canonical probability distribution, and a low entropy past together entail thermodynamic generalizations, but nothing that I say is going to depend on disputed details about that. The crucial part is that the low entropy past makes the macroscopic environment rich with information about its macroscopic past, and locally rich with information about its macroscopic past. So that will create conditions for the emergence of creatures that use information to guide behavior. So assuming whatever conditions are needed to support the emergence of complexity and life, assuming competition for resources and mechanisms for heritable selection, and assuming the mix of regularity and randomness that we actually have in our environment, in the biosphere, you can see how evolution would reward increasingly sophisticated ways of using information. So the tangible signs of predator and prey will be available to any creature moving through forest or field. So such a creature need not actually represent time, but a creature that does represent time and that stores large bodies of information organized temporally can extract regularities, predictive regularities, and then use them to avert, promote, facilitate, or defray events. So a creature like that, a creature that can plan and strategize with an eye to specific ends at some temporal distance, a creature like that will have an advantage. Okay? And of course, that's the kind of thing that you are. And what we want to do here is try to understand what the temporal experience of a creature like that will be. So until now, I've been using the notion of an agent in a kind of small a sense to refer to anything that acts in a small a sense. So any material object, from a rock rolling down a hill to a snowflake melting in the sun, is an agent in this sense. So some of what happens are things that it does. But from here on, I'm going to capitalize the A and use agent and act in the sort of more sophisticated and developed form that it takes in you and me. So creatures that explicitly represent our own actions and strategize and make choices. Okay? So I'm going to leap over all of the kind of intermediate senses of agency. So steps along the scale of increasing cognitive sophistication, from dogs moving around their neighborhood with their nose to the ground, or ants leaving pheromone trails to mark paths to the location of food, squirrels burying nuts in the winter, and we'll leap over all of that right to systems like you and I. So systems that explicitly represent time and choose behaviors with an eye to the records that they will leave. So all of the systems along that scale are making use of the record-bearing properties of their environment. And it's the thermodynamic gradient that creates the condition for their existence as agents in all of these senses. We don't, however, know a lot about the way that other systems actually manage temporal information. So animal cognition, in particular, representation of time, is sort of a frontier in lots of ways in cognitive psychology. So in some ways, it's easiest to start with this sort of fully articulated framework of an agent that represents time in the way that we do, and then see shadows of this structure in creatures that are doing less explicit representation. And obviously, of course, there's a touchstone for accuracy in that case that we don't have in the others, because we have our own experience. So we know what it's like from the inside. For other creatures, it's all conjecture and some limited experiments. Now, the natural thought that a lot of people have had to try to ground psychological time in the arrow of entropy is that we can see that entropy creates an asymmetry in the amount of information that we have respectively about the past and the future. So here's one way of representing information that's available to an agent with access to the macroscopic state of its environment. So this is, I'm going to borrow from David Albert here. We assume an idealized agent in the setting of a thermodynamic gradient. Okay. Now, the information that she has access, immediate kind of perceptual access to, is the surveyable macroscopic state of her environment. We assume the classical laws and a low entropy past. The information about the future that's available to an agent like that, right, is derived like this. And again, I'm relying on David Albert here, but if you don't like the details of his framework, I think you can substitute your own preferred framework, and it's going to look more or less like this. You take the currently surveyable macrostate, you put a probability distribution, which is uniform with respect to the standard measure on phase space over all possible microscopic histories of the world, which are compatible with that macrostate. And then you evolve that distribution forward using the classical dynamical laws. Okay? That distribution will tell our idealized agent, okay, generically to expect thermodynamic behavior. So she will know to expect objects to not to spontaneously combust. She'll know to expect ice cubes to form, not to form out of nothing. So she won't expect anti-thermodynamic behavior. She'll expect thermodynamic generalizations to hold. That distribution she can use together with other bits of specific knowledge to make predictions about how particular systems will behave under controlled conditions. But she won't be able to predict, for example, which path a particular skier will take across a patch of snow in the next 10 minutes, or whether some animal will find its final resting place in a particular patch of earth in the next 200 years. Okay. That kind of information is going to depend on much more than the currently surveyable macrostate of the world. Having that kind of specific knowledge will require much more detailed microscopic information about what other systems are doing. In the case of the buried body, for example, very wide microscopic knowledge of the world, okay, of a kind that's not generally locally available to an agent like this. Okay. To get information about the past, however, we take that same distribution, evolve it backwards, but this time conditionalizing on a low entropy state in the distant past. And now it's easy to tell, for example, which path a skier took through sort of a particular patch of snow. And it's easy to tell that an animal was buried in the place where you find bones 2 centuries later. In general, conditionalizing on the low entropy past is going to make the current macro states of semi-ordered, adiabatically isolated systems in the environment carry traces of earlier events. So specific information about their pasts of the kind that we don't typically have about the future. Okay? So footprints, fossils, melting ice cubes, decaying bones will be remnants of an even more ordered state in the past that can be projected from the current one. And all of that's due to the low entropy past. Now, a view that wanted to ground, did I get that right? Right. So a view that wanted to ground the sense that the future is open on the epistemic arrow, so a very natural thought here, would say that the transformation of possibility into actuality is only at the level of epistemic possibility. So that sense of openness comes from the fact that we just know know less about the future. So Penrose considers this, and rightly, I think, rejects it. So he says, as he says, the direction of psychological time is not just the question about the past being apparently more certainly knowable than the future. It's not the ease of inferring the past that is relevant here, but the feeling that the past is unchangeable. It's not the difficulty that we might have in guessing the future that concerns us, but the feeling that we can affect it. I think he's right about that. The kind of openness in question is something more, if what we're trying to do is capture the sort of openness that we feel, right? Is something more than the merely epistemic sense. And you can see this by thinking about the difference between time and space. So when you cast your eyes, for example, across a landscape or a painting of a landscape, you think of it as a fixed object that comes into view in stages. But you don't think of the future that way. We think of the future as coming into being as it's experienced. So if you work in, say, general relativity, while you're in the office, you have probably a more disengaged view of time. But for most people, kind of while you're at least actively engaged in the process of living, I think the sense of the future being open and coming into being as it's experienced is the most basic pre-theoretic difference between time and space. It's fundamental to the experience of the embedded agent. So you might think, so much the worse for kind of squishy pre-theoretic intuitions, but I think it pays off to try to get this exactly right. That sense of the universe coming into being as it's experienced is, rather than just coming into view, holds sort of clues that will help us sort of understand what time is for us, and also get the sort of sharp edges of our worldview to line up right. And I want to suggest that the problem with the epistemic reading of openness is that it just doesn't take into account that we are part of the universe and our knowledge gathering activity is itself connected in the world that it represents. So it's taking embeddedness very seriously. Instead of suppressing self-reference and treating ourselves as observers outside the universe, let's see what happens if we take it into account without presupposing anything more than the ingredients above. So classical laws, low entropy past, canonical probability distribution. So go back to the computer answering factual questions about the domain in which it's situated. The computer can't truthfully answer the question, is the word that's going to appear on the monitor no? Or the predictor that can't predict the behavior of the simple algorithm that's kind of designed to do the opposite of what is predicted it will do. Now, the problem in those cases wasn't ignorance. It wasn't a lack of information. It's not something that knowing more about how the device works is going to solve. It was that there was negative interference between what it is doing and what it is saying. And we know exactly the shape that that interference takes. And the potential for interference arises for any system that's acting in the domain that it's representing. So if what you're trying to do is build a system that is just going to be a passive repository of knowledge, this is a logical glitch that you want to suppress. But if what you want to do is embody the intelligence, embody the knowledge so that the system can use its knowledge to guide its behavior, the whole point of intelligence from a natural perspective, you realize that this isn't a cute logical glitch. A system like this knows that its knowledge has interaction effects in the domain that it represents. And instead of suppressing or nullifying those effects, it can anticipate them and exploit them. So maybe I'm going to pause to be explicit about a couple of things. So it's hard to recognize self-reference when you're looking at a physical description of the world for a lot of reasons that anybody who's thought about the mind-body problem and mind-body identity statements knows. So you look at some state of the brain and you don't think that event, right, is this thought. But your mental life is actually included in the dynamics of the physical world, but it's subsumed under functional description of processes that are mediating perception to action pathways in a human body. So you kind of know this implicitly, and you do it naturally with other people when you describe or you predict what they are thinking or doing. Right? And you do it for yourself when you vocalize your own thoughts. That is, you recognize the ways in which your own thoughts are wound into the dynamical, sort of the dynamics of the physical world. When you say things like, here's what I'm thinking. And the reason, in part, that I told you the evolutionary story before about the emergence of intelligence was to get you into the frame of mind of viewing what's going on in your brain as just an ordinary part of physics, described at a functional level that calls attention to what it was selected to do, right? Which is to use information to guide behavior. The underlying processes in your brain were arranged in the way that they were arranged to support intelligent processes in something like the way that the hardware in a computer was designed to support information processing. Now, obviously, everything that I'm saying here is taking a very clear side on the mind-body problem. Okay? But if you're going to be a naturalist, that is, if you're going to view yourself as a physical system, this is the kind of thing that you should say. It's a very weak kind of naturalism. So it's one that supposes only that mental processes are included in the dynamical order of the world. You can actually be completely neutral about the aspects of the mind-body problem that are disputed. So in particular, you can be a full-on dualist about phenomenal consciousness, because phenomenal consciousness is precisely the features of mental life that don't play any role, any causal role in bringing about or affecting the movements of bodies. That's what makes the hard problem hard, is you can't give a functional description according to the people that defend the kind of irreducibility of phenomenal consciousness, is that you can't give a functional account of what those features of mental life are. all of the other ones should be functionalizable in this way. Okay? So you can be a dualist about those aspects of the mind-body problem. It won't matter at all to what I'm saying. Also, normally, when we're representing the world in our sort of day-to-day life, we're not representing our own occurrent mental processes or our own internal mental life. We do it sometimes, but usually our focus is on the world outside of us. We're looking at what other people are doing. We're looking at what our bodies are doing. So that's why I also put things in terms of recognizing that our own internal processes, our own mental lives, our current thoughts and experiences are connected in the domain that we're representing by way of their effects on the observable motions of our own bodies. Okay? So even if we're just representing the macroscopic events in the publicly observable landscape, if you're thinking about what to do, you are recognizing that your own thoughts are connected to the movements of your body, and you're exploiting the interaction effects of your own thoughts. Okay? So implicitly or explicitly, you are locating your own current thoughts and decisions in the dynamics of the physical world that you are representing. And if we were to make the logic of your representation fully explicit, we should find self-reference. Okay. So finally, if you're thinking to yourself, I don't get what you're saying, you can describe everything just in terms of physics, one event and then another event, no trouble, no paradoxes, no self-reference. Okay. The same is true with the computer, of course. We can describe the computer at the level of hardware, electricity flowing through transistors, pixelations on screen, and of course, all of that's correct. Okay. There is no threat of contradiction at the level, or constraint even, at the level of physics. The problem is entirely at the representational level. If you've got representation up and running, whether in a computer or whether in a human mind, and the system falls under its own scope, there is going to be self-reference at the semantic level in the content of the representation for that system. Okay. So we are physical systems and we're representing the world, and we're representing the world in which we're acting. So self-reference is unavoidably a part of our own representations of the world. Okay. Now, most of the examples of self-reference in logic, which, you know, it is a huge part of logic, are static. So people are looking at logical relations among eternal propositions. But we are interested in physics, so we're interested in representation as an embodied activity, as something that physical systems do and do in real time. And we're assuming that the universe is a field of events. So self-reference is arising because some of what a system is doing some of what a system is representing is also some of what the system is doing. And it's that's creating interference between two levels, the representational level and the physical level. And we can rig things up as we did with the self-refuting question that we asked, so that the interference was negative. This isn't going to affect what the system can do at the physical level. It's only going to affect the constraints on what the system can truthfully represent. Okay? So the facts about how it's behaving is what's interfering with what it can truthfully represent. So let me repeat all of this now in application to you as a physical system. You are an embodied intelligence, and you are in the business, at least in part, of representing the world. You are acting in the domain that you're representing. So you're negotiating two levels, the physical level and the semantic level. What you do is going to feed into the truth values of the propositions that you're representing. And there's no avoiding that there's going to be interference between those. Representational activity is part of the physical world, is connected to other things in the landscape. What happens it's going to be every physical act is going to register at the representational level. And we're just seeing how it plays out at the representational level in the mind of the creature that's doing the representing. But let me sort of emphasize that this isn't mere psychology. It's not just about, kind of understanding how we experience time. Intelligent activity is part of physics. It moves Earth and it builds cities. Intelligent activity sort of effectively hacks natural processes and becomes the dominant dynamical force at the macroscopic level when it's on scene. So it alters the very ecology of our world. So we can't do physics without understanding that intelligent activity is going to affect the way that things move in the world. So let's go back to the epistemic arrow of time. I'm getting ahead. Okay. Now the practical arrow is just the flip side of the epistemic arrow. So you take the same ingredients, the current macro state, the canonical microprobability distribution, the low entropy past, and what we're doing now is looking into a future about which only the kinds of general things that can be derived from those ingredients, and ask, what should I expect the macro state of the world is going to be like in the future, conditional on some macro event of a kind that I think is more or less under my voluntary control. And it's being under my voluntary control is just a matter of how it is that my mental life, in particular my decisions, are connected to the movements of my body. Okay. What if I, for example, walk across a sandy beach, drop an ice cube into a glass of water, scrape my knee, or dig a ditch, or build a house? Okay. So what if I do some work to create an ordered state of the environment? What can I expect to happen? Okay. And to answer the question, what do? I evolve the current macro state forward, and I can form some relatively reliable expectations. Okay. These things will leave an imprint, okay, records of their occurrence. So if I walk across the sandy beach, I leave footprints. If I drop an ice cube into a warm glass of water, I can expect it to be half there and the water to be cooler in a few minutes. Working on more durable materials like houses and ditches, right? Or building trees, right? Those things take longer to decay. If I build a tree, if I plant a tree, that thing will sort of itself work against the arrow of entropy to preserve its own. And I know all of this. Okay? So I choose my actions with an eye to their expected results. That's what intelligent agency is, acting with foresight and letting the expected results guide your actions. So how do things look over time? As I make choices and act exactly as you'd expect, the future is a field of open possibility, transformed into the thin, hard line of fact by decisions. And notice here that I made no appeal to counterfactuals, only hypotheticals. So things that have a well-defined truth value if we're just looking at physics. What will happen or what would happen if I conditionalize on some future hypothetical macro state, macro event in the environment. Drawing inferences that depend only on the thermodynamic gradient. So, and in particular, I assumed no causal error. The only thing that I've added to the ingredients above is the observation that embodied knowledge is not detached, but engaged. It has interference effects, and it exploits those effects. In the most immediate way, by anticipating and arranging where it has direct control. But in a gentler way, in the sort of wider landscape, by where it sees potential futures, acting to forestall, to avoid, to deter things that it doesn't like, and to promote, encourage, arrange, and facilitate futures that it does. The interference effects are centered on your own body, so they're sort of localized in space, but they're going to run into the future direction for the same reason that records carry information about the past. The interference effects of your actions are effectively records of their occurrence, and they'll kind of propagate into the future indefinitely. So I want to bring out now though what my attitude to the future, if I'm an embedded agent, is going to be. Okay? It's a little stronger than simply that my own decisions are going to provide me with information about the future that I couldn't derive otherwise. Okay? It is that the potential for negative interference is going to keep me from being able to stabilize beliefs about the future in advance. And the crucial thing here is that any prediction made in advance can itself be used as fuel to do something else. Okay? So if you have a system that uses information to guide its behavior, any attempt to predict in advance, if that prediction is made known to it, is unstable because it can be used to undermine the prediction. Okay? So we know this sort of phenomenon from the stock market and political elections, sort of still a sore spot for Americans. Public predictions that guide the behavior of the public predictions in cases like that guide the behavior of the system itself. Okay? They feed back down and they affect what's going to happen to the system. And there are people in the market that are trying to outsmart it, and that creates negative feedback. Okay? Any prediction can itself be used as fuel for overturning it if it's made known or available to the system itself. And that's the whole point of knowledge. Okay? You are always anticipating the future, acting to deter, deflect, and counteract, to promote, encourage, facilitate. So my control over the wider environment is uncertain and it's derivative. Okay? The thing I control directly and where the interference effects of my own knowledge are strongest is when it comes to my own voluntary behavior. Okay? Someone makes a prediction of what I will do. As long as they reveal that prediction, I can do the opposite. If someone tells you that they can predict whether you will raise your arm or blink, okay, they are going and they are going to share their prediction with you, put some money on it and let them try. Okay? You can win that game. Their prediction is going to interfere negatively under those conditions with what it predicts. It's exactly the same as the example I started with. It's the potential for negative feedback that animates the sense that it's not over until the fat lady sings, so to speak. Okay? If you try to stabilize knowledge of the future in advance of making your own decisions, that can itself be used as fuel for overturning it. Okay? And you know that. You know for yourself, when you are making your own decisions up until the last second, you can overturn any earlier expectations that you formed. That's the sense in which it's not over until it's over. The next thought can overwrite the first thought, and the one after that can overwrite the second. Okay? You can go back and forth all night about a situation, about a difficult decision, right? And it's the last thought that's going to that can potentially overturn everything that went before. The basic point is that you can't stabilize the future without stabilizing your own decisions, and you can't stabilize your decisions without making them. Okay? And until the moment that the decision is made, it can be overturned. So I've always loved this quote from William James, which seems to me to get exactly right the kind of phenomenology of decision and the phenomenology of time for an embedded agent. The great point is that the possibilities are really here, whether it be we who solve them or God or physics, if you like, working through us at those soul-trying moments when fate's scales seem to quiver, is of no small account, so long as we admit that the issue is decided nowhere else than in the here and now. That is what gives palpitating reality to our moral life. So putting all of this in terms of interference effects and so on, of course it sounds perverse. The way that you would put it in kind of ordinary language and from an embedded perspective is that my decisions make a difference to the future. And so the future is not fixed until I make my decisions. But what we're trying to do is to try to understand kind of the underlying logic of that way of speaking, to recover that way of speaking, to see why it arises and what it signals in terms that presuppose only statistical mechanics and interference effects. So if I'm sitting outside of a system and I'm simply trying to predict the behavior of the system, it's a different matter. Okay? It might be hard to predict what it's going to do because it's complex or because I'm missing some of the relevant information. But what's going on here is a different kind of thing. It's not just a lack of information, right? It's interference. It's the inability to stabilize the system independently of my predictions about what it's going to do. That's the point that was made by the self-defeating answers of the computer and the self-defeating attempt to predict a system if my prediction is made known to the system. In those cases, the problem wasn't missing information. It was interference. The potential for negative interference prevents you from stabilizing your future and the future of the world in which you act as a potential object of knowledge in exactly the same way the suggestion is. So that's a sort of ham-fisted way of putting it. From a thermodynamic point of view, what's happening here is that your actions are leaving future records and you're choosing them with an eye to the records that they will leave. So your knowledge of the future is interfering with the thing that you're trying to know about. Okay? In principle, it's anything in the choice dependent, the interference effects will run into the choice dependent region downstream. Right? Temporally, anything in your future light cone can, in principle, bear the marks of your present actions. Okay? In practice, though, of course, the interference effects are strongest and easiest to control in the immediate aftermath of action. And so you kind of build on them. You are always thinking about what to do, acting on your own decisions, and living in the wake of your own decisions, and sort of plotting your next move. When you're thinking about your future, you're actively engaged in trying to shape it. So you're trying to avoid, forestall, avert. Of course, it's true that nothing you are going to do now is going to make a difference to whether, for example, the sun comes up tomorrow, or whether some captive panda in China has a boy or a girl, a captive pregnant panda. So there are features of the world, of course, and features of the future that are not going to experience these interference effects at all. But your day-to-day life is strongly centered on the regions of the world in which its own interference effects are the strongest. And all of this is true not because you're a magical thing that comes from outside of nature and intervenes on it, interrupts the orderly law-governed flow of events, but because you are part of nature and your own thoughts and decisions are part of that law-governed flow. You can't predict the future without encountering the interference effects. Your thoughts interrupt the ordinary law-governed flow from the inside. And your ability to act on your knowledge is going to interfere with your ability to know in advance. Okay? Now, all agents rely on the thermodynamic gradient to some extent. So all agents, small a agents, medium a agents, large a agents, are using information contained in records to guide behavior whose rationale depends on its effects. So the rationale of the behavior depends on the records it's going to leave in the environment. That's simple to see if you're just thinking about animals responding to the immediate signs of predators and prey. So, you know, sort of a deer or a dog or an ant. Sophisticated cognitive agents like you and I harness that, self-consciously choosing actions with an eye to the records that they will leave. So interference effects arise because our information gathering activity is connected in the world. It's embodied and it guides action in the very domain that we're getting information about. If agency is acting in the domain that we are representing, then intelligent agency is realizing that you're acting in the domain that you're representing and exploiting the interference effects to create a desirable future. The effects are explicitly perspectival, though. The strength of interference between your choices and other events will depend on how your choices are connected in the world. Okay? So it's different for you than it is for me, even though we're acting in the same world. Okay? And they're going to taper off quickly in space. Okay? And they will be asymmetric in time. From a physical perspective, if you are a naturalist, so if you think that minds are just part of nature, you are making choices and decisions. You making choices and decisions is just physics, is part of the fabric of what happens in the world. Okay? From your own perspective, we are making decisions about how things go, and precisely because our current thoughts and experience are an essential and integral part of nature, they are going to interfere strongly with what lies ahead. And in particular with what lies most immediately ahead in our own futures. So let's go back now and examine the contours of this and see why it matters to getting the psychological arrow of time right. So there are two ingredients. There's self-reference and there's the thermodynamic gradient. The point about self-reference is entirely time symmetric. The asymmetry comes from the thermodynamic gradient. Whether you are explicitly representing your own knowledge gathering and decision-making procedures, or you're just representing the publicly observable movements of bodies in the physical environment, your knowledge is going to be connected in the world by way of its effects on the movements of your own body and the ripples of those movements. So the records created by your own body, whether you're planting a tree or building a house or putting an ice cube in a warm glass of water, those are going to run into the future in a way that's going to keep you from stabilizing your beliefs about the future in advance. So for an agent like this, looking into her own future, there isn't the merely epistemic kind of unfixity or unsettledness, but a directly practical kind of openness. Okay? I can myself act. So if somebody makes a prediction about what's going to happen, or I form an idea about what's going to happen tomorrow, I can myself act to forestall, avert, derail any antecedent expectations or predictions about what will happen. I won't always be successful, but I can be successful in a limited way. Okay? And to the extent to which my actions can make a difference, I won't be able to stabilize those expectations. Okay? The future can be, for me, no more stable than my decisions about what to do and the interference effects of those decisions. So why does this matter? I think it doesn't matter for the practices of physics. Most often in physics, we are modeling other systems. And even in cosmology, none of it's going to make a bit of difference to our ability to, for example, represent the universe at large scales. Nothing you do in the here and now is going to realistically make a bit of difference to features of the universe that cosmologists study. So the sort of instability that comes from the fact that we are part of the world that we are representing is almost irrelevant to cosmology. It does give us a better understanding of the psychological arrow of time. So it helps us slot in that last piece in a complicated structure that in a way that I think solidifies the foundation. If what we're trying to do is understand how all of the different arrows of time line up in a way that jives with our understanding what the underlying physical laws are, at least at the level that seems like it's going to make a difference to understanding kind of human mental life. So it does help us though, understand ourselves, and it helps us understand what time is for us. And to do so in a way that sort of solidifies or affirms our understanding of the underlying physics. Our own personal view of the world is completely organized around that instability. The scale is much smaller when we're when we're representing the world in our day-to-day lives, and when we're representing the world in cosmology or in physics. Okay? And it's explicitly centered on the choice-dependent region in which the interference effects of our own actions are very strong. And it's not an accident, of course, that that's where our attention is focused in our day-to-day lives. The whole point of your intelligence from a naturalistic point of view, that complex loop of neurally supported computational activity that interrupts the perception to action pathways in your body, is to use knowledge to interfere in what happens in the domain that we're representing. So I put all of this in the most neutral way possible, and sort of refrained from drawing philosophical conclusions about things like, for example, free will. And the only philosophical conclusions has been an attempt to sort of try to get the pieces of our worldview to line up in a consistent way. From the outside, the universe is a seamless four-dimensional manifold. The manifold as a whole just is. Notions of past and future and fixity and openness all have to do, or all have to be understood from an embedded perspective. Even the logic of those notions, past and future, that's something that refers to a particular perspective in the manifold. From the perspective of a decision-making agent inside the universe, I think the universe is rightly seen as coming into being as it is experienced, and the future can't be any more stable. Its future can't be any more stable than its own decisions about what to do next. But let me say that this shouldn't be understood in too thinly epistemic a way. So there's a very natural thought that one might have that this sort of transformation of potentiality into actuality is really still in the end a purely epistemic one, at least in a deterministic setting, one might think. It's only in your own mind that there's a plurality of possibilities. Because we're working with macro structures, and so forward prediction is limited. From a physical point of view, one might think in a deterministic setting, in fact, once the initial conditions are in place, there is only one possible future. So one part of this is correct. From a detached perspective, there is only what is. What will be, end of story. Relativity unequivocally rules out the idea that there is any global process, any global directed process of the universe itself coming into being. So it rules out one way of trying to be a realist about the transformation of potentiality into actuality. But if we restrict attention to kind of relativistically well-defined internal notions of past and future, and we consider, if we look at a particular world line, and we consider the relationship between the absolute past and the absolute future at any point P along the world line of an embedded system in any of the kinds of local deterministic theories that we have examples of, even if we fix the complete contents of the past light cone at P, that complete microscopic contents of the past light cone at P for such a creature, there will be indefinitely many nomologically possible futures. Okay. So that is because you need to take the total state of the universe into account, and that will include events, of course, outside of its past light cone. So for a creature like that, the reduction of potentialities into, into sort of possibilities for the future will be real, and it will happen in real time. The set of events nomologically sufficient to determine an event E for a creature like that is not contained in its own past light cone. And in fact, will not, the events that are needed. So if we consider, I never know how, I always want to point at my screen. So if we consider an agent here at some point P, and it's looking into its future about what will happen at some point P primed, okay? Its own past, its own microscopic past will not determine what happens at that point. It needs to include events that are in its absolute elsewhere. Indeed, there will be indefinitely many nomologically possible futures and indefinitely many nomologically possible events that could happen at that later moment. And the events that are nomologically sufficient to determine that point won't be in place from its point of view until that event itself. So it's not merely that we're looking only at macroscopically possible. It's not merely that we're thinking of the macroscopic past as fixed. That's making this transformation of potentiality into actuality real for the embedded agent. Okay. So the idea that there are many possible futures is not just an artifact of the macro perspective. The reason that our senses are sensitive to macroscopic structure rather than microscopic is that cognition works on records and traces. That's where the opportunities for using information to guide behavior are located. It's the record-bearing properties of the macroscopic environment. The fact that the macroscopic environment bears the imprint of its own macroscopic past, and that the future will bear the imprint of the macroscopic present that agency exploits. So whether it's described in microscopic or macroscopic terms, as we trace a path up your world line, we will see a process of your choices and actions are part of the process that transforms potentiality into actuality. So whether you're looking into the future on the precipice of a difficult decision, when you're looking into the future on the precipice of a difficult decision, the future hangs in the balance while you deliberate, and it's brought to a close at the moment of decision. And second, and maybe this doesn't need to be said, but the kind of interference that we're talking about when we say that the ripples of your own actions interfere with your ability to know the future isn't the kind of interference that arises when sort of there's some object blocking another from view. Nor is it like what happens when you, for example, turn on the light to check if your children are sleeping, or when you measure something that's altered in the course of the measurement. Okay. In those cases, there isn't independently a well-defined fact of the matter about what's there that you're trying to ascertain, and your attempts to ascertain it are just unsuccessful because you create a disturbance. In this case, there is not. It's more like you're trying to reach for a floating object in water, and the motion of your arm pushes it out of reach. or maybe it's more like what's going on in quantum mechanics. There are lots of ways in which the kind of interference that I'm talking about here, that is the inability to stabilize the state of a system independently of the questions you ask about it, is built right into the foundations of that theory. But to get a proper understanding of this, we can't treat ourselves, as we mostly do in physics, as sitting outside the universe and looking down at it. We have to absorb our own lives, including the thoughts and the deliberations, into the fabric of the universe as an essential and integral part of what happens. We can't infer much about our futures from our past, or maybe much of what we care about, at least in day-to-day life, without passing through our own decisions. And that means that all of the sort of unfixity, unsettledness, the contingency of our own decisions bleeds out into the world that we're representing. Getting this piece right also shifts other things that matter. Sort of maybe not things that matter so much to the practice of physics, but to places where trying to understand ourselves in physical terms really kind of pinches philosophically, where the shoe sort of pinches philosophically. And it's just in general, I think, an important reminder that we are part of the universe, and an important correction to that tendency to think about the universe from a transcendent point of view. There's a sort of strong tendency to remove ourselves from the universe when we model it in physics, and then to think about that the differences between the way things are from the perspective of physics and the way things seem to us reveals that the way they seem is somehow illusory. Okay? But when it comes to understanding time as we know it, we need to abandon time as we know it. We need to abandon the fiction that we are outside the universe. This is just what it is to be a part of the universe, not a spectator, but one of the objects that's being represented. Thank you. And I will stop my share.
Thank you, Jim. Okay, so as usual, questions, please raise your hand or write in.
Look, I just need to be absent for about 10 minutes. So I've got to cut. I'll come back in 10 minutes because I really would like to pose a question, but I can't. Anyway, I just need to sort something out. I'll be back. Okay.
Be the first on the list when you're back.
Okay.
Okay, so I see Dustin.
Yeah, thank you very much for the beautiful talk. Actually, I think I have less of a question and more of sort of praise, because I feel like what you're doing is quite unique, that you are looking at physics as much as possible from a first-person perspective, so to speak. Is that right? Because I think, yeah.
I mean, I guess the way I would put it is I'm looking at the implications that physics, as we more or less understand it from a third-person perspective, have for the first person, how things should be for an embedded agent. Yeah.
Right. But is it fair to say that, because you're building also on David's account or similar accounts that already go a long way towards explaining the difference between past and future, where it seems where we can know more about the past and the future, where it seems to us that we can influence the future but not the past, and really what is I would say revolutionary, but don't want to use a word that sounds maybe too exaggerated, is that you're looking at the first person consequences of that. Is that like a fair
100%
way of putting it?
Yeah.
Okay, great. No, it was really, really great. Thank you.
Mauro Dorato, you're muted.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Jenann, for your wonderful talk. Brilliant and innovative. I have a question concerning these two perspectives that you try to defend. Namely, on the one hand, you seem to claim that there's no other way we can describe the universe but from the inside. But on the other, so it seems that you're just claiming that there's some sort of locally growing block, because when you act to bring about something, it seems that there's nothing in the unrestricted sense that it's before your action. It's a growing block, it seems to me, because you're saying it's non-epistemic, it's more than epistemic. But on the other, you say, well, there's a way of looking in the universe which really amounts to believe that there is a four-dimensional seamless whole. But it's either one or the other. It seems to me that if you look at the history of the universe, we are the product of a very long story: formation of galaxies, formation of stars, then the planet Earth, and then the origin of life, and we are inside that. So why not having a growing block and leave alone this God's eye point of view? I don't know whether my question was clear enough or not. And well, I have problems with the notion of action, but it's taking too much time. I'm sorry.
No, these are right on point. So, and the question is perfectly understandable. I think, these are what I want to say about it is formally that these two perspectives are perfectly well defined. And in fact, when you understand the logic of the relationship between them, they're entirely compatible. So I disagree with the first thing that you said, that that somehow I'm trying to say that the third person perspective is illegitimate. I think what I do want to say is that there is some ways of understanding the third person perspective that I would reject. For example, the idea, and they're closely connected with this. So, but what I do want to end up saying is, properly understood, these are not only compatible, but they're interdefinable, and neither is more fundamental than the other. And that, when you talk about the universe from a third person perspective, you have to recognize that according to the third person perspective, you are an embedded agent. And that will mean that, and I'm going to borrow a phrase that I really like from Carlo here, that there's a kind of essential incompleteness to the universe, the idea of the universe for us, that derives from that. And in fact, we can show formally exactly why that's so. So take an embedded agent, any embedded agent. It's provably the case that there is no finite effective procedure that will tell for any event E whether or not E is part of the totality that we're trying to capture when we say the universe. And this is supposed to be a diagnosis of that. But to be a diagnosis of that, that doesn't commit you to anything like a growing block. The idea is, and there's patently no temporal asymmetry in it. The idea is just that, so I had a way of putting it before I started talking. Let me think for a second. I can't get back to the way that I was thinking of putting it, but that's what I want to say, that this is a diagnosis of that completeness.
Can I have a quick example, or maybe I will wait for other questions?
No, you can go.
But if I claim, and it's not really an unreasonable claim, that in 5 billion years, the sun will become a red giant, why is that just the first person perspective of the world? It seems a very reasonable prediction about what's going to happen. And
why do you think that conflicts with anything I said?
I'm claiming the world, the sun will become a red giant in 5 billion years. But as of now, that is, as of this moment of time, relative to our talking, it's not a matter of fact that the sun has become a red giant. So it's not a first person, it's just a prediction of something that is not there yet, not in a temporal sense, but just in an unrestricted sense. It's not a fact of the matter that the sun will become, I mean, it will become, but it's not a red giant now.
So I've never understood these ways. I know that people are attracted to these ways of speaking, and I've never understood them. To me, it seems that if you're using temporal notions, you know, from a first-person embedded perspective, and you say what's the case now, and what was the case in the past, and you make a prediction about the future, all of that is fine, and all of that's perfectly understandable from, you know, a point of view where you represent the universe itself as a four-dimensional manifold. So you make the temporal, and I know that you've thought a lot about this, and I know that you disagree, but I'll just say the way that I'm thinking of it, you know, that you make the temporal parameter internal to the universe, and now you just have to translate all of that into relativization to particular moments in time. In both of those cases, things happen when they happen and at no other time. So you make a prediction about the future, and that's something that can be made sense of as a prediction about what will happen at a particular point in the four-dimensional manifold. So, you know, I understand that there's a different way of speaking, a different way of thinking of these, but I will be completely honest, I've never understood that, and I've never understood why it's supposed to conflict with what I think of as a mere transformation in the way that we represent time by making, you know, writing down an explicit temporal parameter and relativizing to points along that parameter.
Thanks.
So I know I haven't convinced you, but this is a different, this is a dispute that that we won't settle here. And
of course not.
Yeah.
There is I don't know if it was a follow-up or a question by Carlo.
It's a question. It's a long comment, so I can wait any moment. And Paul is back, so whatever.
Because I promised him, and then you can go next.
Okay, donc, Christian?
Yes, we can hear.
Stay for me? Okay. Well, Jenann, you know, this is it's a very thought-provoking subject, and as you said towards the end, I mean, we have to clearly separate the issue of free will from thinking about this. I mean, I'm sure we all agree that physics is going to have nothing to say about the problem of free will, and if we have a deterministic physics, then presumably free will is some sort of illusion, but an illusion that we have to have because we lose our humanity without it, as Peter Strawson sort of said, it's a sort of contradiction we have to live with. But I was trying to just...
Can I say something about that, though? Because I know it's not the main part of your comment. So there's different ways of approaching the problem of free will. One is that you come to physics with some antecedent ideas about what free will would have to be, and you see whether physics satisfies that. Yeah. And another one is to say, you know, and I think this is more like my own attitude, is it's not that I have some firm idea of what free will is pre-theoretically. There's no question that you take a random person off the street and you give them physics and you tell them about determinism, and they realize that they're kind of shocked by it. And that should be the beginning of trying to understand ourselves in the framework of physics and understand, you know, what agency amounts to and so on. But the result of that process is no doubt very different from ideas about themselves that they had beforehand, but not necessarily anything that doesn't in some ways give them a rich idea of what they are that supports everything that matters about free will. I mean, so there's different ways of understanding what the problem is. Is it about affirming all my pre-theoretic ideas, or is it about coming up with a natural way of understanding ourselves, a naturalistic way of understanding ourselves that actually teaches us something, but something that's preservative of the important core of what matters in terms of agency and efficaciousness of action and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I think I completely agree with that. And I think in a way, it's the beginnings of that sort of idea of ourselves as being embedded in the physical world, which is leading to the idea of diminished responsibility, the idea that people's prejudices and so on are the result of upbringing or whatever. I mean, we begin to sort of unpeel the onion, if you like, and see more of why people behave in the way they are, how they are influenced by different things. But at the same time, one can well imagine it's a never-ending process. However much we come to understand ourselves, there will be more to understand, because in coming to have understood ourselves better, we will have become more complex and so on and so on. But the real point that I wanted to get to, and it's not really exactly a question, but it's just to introduce the sort of the possibility of another perspective on this, because I think the idea of the view from nowhere in science is very powerful, and one wants to be careful not to undermine it somehow. And so I've been thinking about it from the point of view of a many worlds view, the sort of view that Lev would be happy with. And there, if you're thinking about a view from nowhere, looking down on an agent in inverted commas, if you like, in some situation, what one's going to see is all the possibilities are actualized, the future possibilities are actual, each with their attendant probability. And that is going to be part of what's going to be determining that is going to be the brain state of the person who's there, that's right. But from that perspective, there's no question of this sort of actualization of possibilities. I mean, what's in a way, that idea seems to be confronting one with is that from the perspective of the agent, what they're seeing, if they believe the many worlds view, is there's this range of futures, and I'm going to split off into all these futures, and they've got their attendant probabilities. And from the view from nowhere, the probabilities appear as branch weights, if you like. And in a way, I think that helps perhaps a little bit to argue that, well, branch weights just are are objective probabilities, but that's something else. So how can I put it? So the agency, I mean, in as much as one can act to, how can I say, replacing the idea of what one does in acting is try to actualize the future that one wants and not the future that one doesn't want. What one does is one acts to try and change the probabilities. One tries to increase the probabilities of the future one, decrease those of the ones that you don't want. Sort of an observation. I mean, it's just perhaps another way of looking at the picture that you're sort of describing. I don't know, what do you think of that?
Yeah, actually, I mean, so up until the last thing you said, I was thinking, how would one think of this in a many world setting? I think you put it exactly right. What you think the interference effects of your action are will depend on exactly what you think the physical, you have to embed it in, a kind of physical setting and a physical regime, and see, and just as you do for normal, everyday lives, what you think the interference effects of your action are going to depend on your, kind of causal presuppositions and so on. So for an Everettian, I think that's exactly right. The interference effects of your actions, where your actions are choices of measurements, is going to be nothing but altering the probabilities of the branches. So I think that's the right way to put it. I think it transposes in a pretty straightforward way, actually.
Yeah. Okay. Okay, good.
So thank you. Yeah.
Dustin, is that a question or a follow-up?
A bit of both, but maybe Carlos should go first because he's been waiting a long time.
Okay, Carlos.
Okay. Thank you very much, Jenann. And you complained at saying I've heard you many times. I shouldn't listen, but that's not right at all. I should listen because I learn every time I listen to you, and it seems to me that the perspective you're presenting it's very wide. It's much wider than one reads at first time listen to you. Let me just throw some extremely vague comments, completely non-rigorous and probably badly said, but.
You're like Biden. It's like you under-promise and over-deliver.
You're a Marxist, deep down, and I mean in the most complimentary way I can. In the sense, knowledge is not abstract; is embedded. It's embedded in reality. Marx would say historically embedded. So it seems to me that you have a wide project here, and you're using it for agency, for time, for a number of things. But the point is wider, and let me try to phrase it in this way. In contemporary culture, at least in the one in which we are swimming, our tribe somehow, there are two big belief assumptions, whatever. One is some form of naturalism or physicalism, even materialism in some sense, if you want. All that goes in that direction. The world is there, and everything which is mental, it just comes out in a corner of this universe because sufficiently nice and interesting thing has happened, has produced us in our mental. That's one. And the other, it's a sort of rationalism, based on empiricism, a rational in the sense that knowledge, it exists by itself, is reliable, it nourishes on experiences, nourish on logic. And the two things are both revered and kept separated. And from a theoretical physicist, this is very strong. I mean, we have we know how the world is because we have a set of laws written down. We have a set of information written down in our papers, our computers. And this is, of course, all this lives in a mental world. And we constantly revere this large body of knowledge about the universe. So we end up with a sort of picture in which there's no subject or object or anything like that. We forgot sort of the debate of European 19th century discussion. But there's a world out there, and there's our theories about the world, which understand so well, allows us to make predictions. And you're coming and saying, wait a minute, there's a contradiction here. Where does this body of knowledge live? Is it somehow in the angels, in the mind of God, in the mind of whom? It's sitting inside the universe which is being described. Okay, and every naturally will say, yeah, sure, of course, we know, but consider this as a side remark. So of course, my knowledge is written in books, and my books are written in Italian, but that's irrelevant. And you say, no, wait a minute, it's not irrelevant at all. The fact that the knowledge, it's a part of the reality being described. So you're coming back to this thing, and the self-reference, it's just, you know, sort of seeing all the way down to the point in which it obviously breaks. And also the, you know, the machine that does the opposite of what, that cannot answer the question, what is on your screen, the answer to my question going to be no. Again, it's somehow from both perspectives, from the perspective of physics, come on, what's the point? I mean, it's just my thermostat in some other way. There's nothing to and from the point of knowledge, also, it's I mean, I just don't use that machine, I use something else. But there's a moment in which you realize that the two things cannot be separated. That that you see that some of the apparent incomprehensible aspect of the world have a source there. That's what you seem, but this is a very wide enterprise that you're doing, because you know, if you read in terms of the European philosophy of 2 centuries ago, this is a replaying of the game of the subject and the object of knowledge, and essentially you're asking when the object of knowledge is a subject itself. That's the kind of problems that you're falling into. And okay, so these are very common. I'm not, and the connection to Marx is actually strong, because it's one of the main big step of at least Marx himself and Engels even more, and some of the later thinking is exactly that. I mean, there is no knowledge, there is no thinking, there is no mind, if not as part of the world itself, and praxis cannot be separated from theory, which is exactly the point you're making. I mean, if I think about theory without connecting to the fact that it's related to action inside the world, I fail to understand a number of things that you're pointing out. So sorry, these are very common, but maybe too wide. I thought were. No, I mean they're you know, obviously I agree with everything you said. I think that though it's in a way just an artifact. If you know, physics has become so articulated and so complete in its contours that all of these old philosophical problems are showing up, you know, in the parts of physics where we're really having trouble reconciling it philosophically. So it's not as though I had grand ambitions, but I think when, you know, if you look carefully at the parts of, you know, the physical worldview that are difficult and problematic, I mean, that's exactly right. You're finding that old nugget about the issue between the subject and object of knowledge coming up in a way that's sharper and clearer than it was, for example, in continental philosophy in early 19th century. So, but yes, it's exactly the same thing. And I mean, I love the way that you put it in terms of, so if you're looking at all of these big squishy problems, how do we understand time from physics, from our own point of view? How do we understand what physics says about action and, you know, then the way that we experience it? And you're exactly right that the thing about self-reference does a beautiful job of making it not the clash of big and, you know, squishy intuitions or worldviews, but making it absolutely clear that in its own terms, there is a point at which the physics breaks. And you can hinge a whole lot about understanding the first person perspective by taking very seriously two things. One is the instability introduced by that little point, and then seeing how big a difference the change in scale makes when you go from looking at the, you know, kind of from a God's eye point of view at the universe as a whole. It's perspectival, it's almost trivial, it's not going to make, but then you focus in on the perspective of the agent, where everything is organized around that instability, and all of those first person sort of, you know, asymmetries that really matter, you know, in terms of everyday life, are
are very strong, you know, and easily kind of hinge on that asymmetry. So yes, I mean, I think you're right that there are large forces that are in a way coming down to properly understanding in a very precise way what's going on with the first person, you know, when you take self-reference seriously. And you have to take it seriously. It's not an option. That's the point.
Sorry for calling you a Marxist. It was a
no, I'm welcome. I'm as aware as much. I'll say one more thing because it attaches to what Justin was saying. So, you know, I think and also a little bit more, you know, I think of it, well, now I'm trying to say too much. So I'll say two quick things. I mean, I think of the fact that you can intertranslate between them. You see the first person perspective really, you know, is forced on you from trying to take the third person perspective. And also you can translate out. You can say, I understand how from an embedded perspective, we start to amass this large body of knowledge and how this large body of knowledge itself aspires to becoming a fully encompassing view of kind of a closed world that from the inside has this bit of essential incompleteness. I mean, I think those two things fit together formally, completely, even though from a first person perspective, one is always wanting to privilege the first person perspective and say, oh, really, the world is coming into being as I experience it. And all of this other stuff is just abstract, you know, kind of an abstract representation. And also from the third person perspective, you can say the world is a four-dimensional manifold. And I can see exactly why I think of it in the way that I do by looking at the first person perspective. The phrase that I like for bringing those two together is one I take from Abner Shimoni. So he talked about closing the circle. And for him, he thought of it in terms of we have to understand the epistemology of physics from, you know, how we arrive at physics, but then we have to also understand ourselves as knowers from the perspective of what physics tells us the right ontology is. And he said, only then will we have brought, you know, the circle to a close. And that's what I think of as attempting here.
Sorry to intervene, but just to clarify, so you wouldn't want to privilege any of these two views ontologically either?
Well, I mean, privilege ontologically, what does that even mean? You know, we are embedded agents. That's exactly correct. And from a first person perspective. So I don't think there is any, I don't know what it would mean to privilege either ontologically. They affirm one another. And
Or just in a sense, if I want to say that, well, there really is this block universe. And I think one could say that the block universe is enough to ground the truth value for all the statements you make from the first person perspective. But then you can go a long way towards accounting for what it is like to be an agent inside this block universe and why therefore it feels like it seems like the
yes, for the first part, yeah. So yes, for the first part, the universe is a four-dimensional manifold of events. And yes, it really is coming into being as we experience it from our perspective. And yes, it has an essential incompleteness without us because we are part of the universe and we act. And yes, I haven't acted yet and it can't be stable as an object of knowledge until I've acted. So that's what I mean by when you start thinking about it, it's very hard to come up with the idea, well, it just feels that way. It seems that way because that's the way it is from a first person perspective. And the universe includes, I mean, another way of thinking of it is the universe, at least the biosphere. If we just focus in on the biosphere is a collection of systems making decisions about what to do. And what the biosphere is just the collective product of what those systems do. So I don't see why either undermines the other, comes out as somehow primary. And I think that they're the same.
I don't think about physics as me trying to describe the world, but in an even more disembodied way, as a theory trying to describe the world. And if there is a correct solution of the theory that describes the actual world, okay, of course, I would be somewhere there on this on the space-time manifold, right? So in this sense, I don't believe that physics is leaving me out. It's just not.
Yeah, I think we're in complete agreement.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, I think we are in complete agreement. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
There is a question from Lev.
Thank you, Jenann. Let's say before I want to understand the universe, I want to have theory which give me the full explanation of universe. And at least before your talk, I thought that this self-reference problem, I'm not supposed to worry about that. Of things you mentioned, okay, this is semantics. I don't see much difference with the Lyra paradox. And so what I thought will be enough to understand the universe is the following. I have a closed room and I'm outside the room, which in the room I can put some maybe people, observers, some objects. And I will put all possible conditions in this room, which will not will be against physics, which are consistent with physics. And I want to understand, I want to have a theory which will tell me what these people will do. Now, and I think if I will know exactly what they will say, for me, it will be enough. Of course, there is another perspective, maybe inside they think something and there's something different. There is this question, but again, I don't think it's particularly important for physicists. If I know everything that they will say, then I understand what's going on. And this is a third person perspective. For me, this person is an object. And if I know how this object behaves, I understand the whole story. So now, during your talk, you said that, okay, so third person perspective is fine, but still there are kind of friction, difficulties, and whatever. So can I just be happy if I will kind of think that there is a theory like this, which in fact I think, well, we do have theory like this. I don't think there is any kind of serious problem. I think physicists understand essentially everything. And these self-reference problems, they don't talk about them, and maybe they don't understand them, but maybe they not necessarily need to. Oh.
Right. Okay. I don't think physicists need to worry about it. I said that explicitly. I said that that it's not so much a problem as a solution to a problem. And here's what I mean by that. When physics presents the world in a certain way, as a sort of complete story, and it represents time as represents a human being, one of the things that happens is that when people try to assimilate that philosophically, they think, oh, it ends up undermining it's very hard to make sense of our own experience, and it ends up rendering features of our own experience illusory. We think we are in some way deluded about the world. What I'm suggesting is that if we re-embody ourselves and try to understand ourselves as objects in the world, we will see that from our point of view, the physical world will have exactly the kind of instability that I was talking about. We should expect the sorts of unfixity and unsettledness and the sort of sense of the world coming into being as experience. There you go over there. As it is being experienced that I described.
I'm not. If I put.
Wait, can I say? Sorry, I'm sorry. This might help too. There was one other thing I wanted to say. Of course, you're right. You can describe everything externally. So can the computer. The computer is not going to be able to correctly describe its own behavior. This isn't about internal things. The computer will not be able to correctly describe the question about what's going to appear on it, whether no will appear on its output channel. That's part of the public macroscopic environment in which the computer acts.
I'm really confused. I have a room, I have some people and computer which ask him exactly this question which you, so I understand what will happen. I will know that it will say it's an illegitimate question, you change your semantics. So then I think I understand everything. You say computer will not be able because you ask illegitimate questions, so it will not answer. It's not that it's not capable of anything. It's just the question which you ask is not good.
Mm-hmm. And what the question brings out is that there's going to be negative interference between what it says and what it's trying to describe. And the whole talk was built around showing you what that instability does to the person in the world trying to represent the world. It's not, there's no problem, there's no question that reality is inconsistent. We can describe physical totalities with perfect consistency. From an embedded perspective, you are not going, any embedded perspective, computer in a closed room, person in a universe, you are not going to, for exactly that logical reason that I described, be able to give a correct answer to any factual question that can be asked of you.
Okay, I'm still, because it seems to be, if I cannot make a correct answer, so there is a problem. But if the question is illegitimate, then there is no problem.
Question, so in what sense?
I think what we should learn, just we have to be careful about semantics. Don't ask questions that you are not supposed to ask it. Don't the set theory, all kinds of paradoxes. We have to define our axioms carefully, so we will not run into a paradoxes. But it's not that we are limited in any way, internally or externally.
So just about
internally, I cannot understand myself. I don't think any problem, but I cannot understand the whole universe. I still don't.
Okay, so a couple of things. Yes, you have to go slower for me. So a couple of things. First, if it's a matter of just coming up with the right semantics, it's provably impossible to come up with a complete and consistent, extension of first-order arithmetic that's not going to run into paradoxes. This is the lesson of logic of the last 1.5 centuries. But put that aside, it's not just that people are confused about this. You're absolutely right that there's something about the question that's pathological. We know in advance, and we know it not because of any factual, missing information, that the computer is not going to be able to answer. But and we can certainly ask it a question that will create positive rather than negative interference. Is the answer that's going to appear in the output channel yes? It cannot not answer that correctly. What both of those things are meant to do is bring out in as sharp a way possible that when you're part of the system that you're describing, right, there's interference between it's a trivial logical point that I've showed really does shape the first person, or I tried to argue really does shape in important ways the first person perspective. But it's just an artifact of the fact that when you're part of what you're describing, some of what you do is going to make make truth and make falsity for some of what is there to be described. Okay. It's not saying that there's a problem from physics. It's not saying that somehow the world is inconsistent. It's using the logic of the first person perspective to explain features of the first person perspective. And one of the things that's absolutely essential to the first person perspective is whether or not you're describing yourself, your actions are going to be connected in the environment in which you act. That is, the knowledge that you have is going to make a difference to what happens, partly because the knowledge of the knowledge that you have is going to make a difference to how you move around. That's what you were made to do. That's the kind of physical system you are. You're the kind of physical system who gathers knowledge and who uses that knowledge to affect behavior. If you're trying to understand the physics of a situation in which there are intelligent people moving around, knowledge gathering activity is going to be part of that. So that's all I was saying. I don't think that that maybe you understood fully what I was trying to say, or that you thought it was somehow supposed to undermine a third person, the legitimacy or consistency of a third person point of view. It wasn't trying to do that.
Okay, thank you.
We have time for one or two questions. There's Quentin next.
Hi, thank you so much. I loved it and completely agree with everything you said. I'm gonna ask you a question about time. It seems to me that from what you're saying, time emerges from our existence in a thermodynamic gradient. That's our sort of phenomenological experience of time. But then I was wondering if your ontology of time is that emergence from thermodynamics, or if it's or if we shouldn't embed the directionality of time in the laws of physics, which have spatialized times instead of temporalizing or directioning space. I was wondering where you place yourself on this. And then a quick thing on at multiple points in the talk, you said that
can I answer one at a time? Okay, because it's very, my head starts racing and I don't listen. So I'll answer this, but I want to hear the second one too. And here I'm gonna take a page from Carlo's book, because I think this is exactly the right way to put it. Whenever I talked about time in the psychological direction, I said time as we know it. Partly because I think the right way to speak about it is to say, of course, there's a T parameter in in kind of the geometry of the manifold, and there are laws with a T parameter, and then there's a thermodynamic gradient which is separable from that. And I think you need all of those things in place before you have before you can start talking about the phenomenology as I was describing it. So I don't want to make choices about where and when time arises in that hierarchy. I think, just put it all in place, and then try to describe time as we know it, as, sort of by appealing to all of that infrastructure. Does that help?
Yeah, thanks a lot. And for the other one was just when you said it doesn't really matter for our practice of physics, but I feel that when you go at the quantum level, there's this constant intertwining and becoming of the interaction, like all the questions about consciousness measuring the experiment. I mean, feel really they should reflect on what you said in a sense, because then it's a sort of intra-action. And I was wondering if the work of Karen Barad, I feel, does this thing of intra-action, where she says that quantum mechanics is sort of lost in a few questions because it hasn't really thought it's not the experimentation that measures what is the particle, but it's much more of a becoming of an interaction of the entities. Would that fit with what you're saying here?
So yes. So with qualifications, first, what was the name? Who?
Karen Barad. So I don't.
Okay.
She's more of she's an STS feminist theorist. Maybe not philosophy, and maybe not in the traditional analytical philosophy from what I understand from it, but maybe the STS side more.
Cool. So the answer is the kind of interference that I was talking about, where I said you can't stabilize the object of knowledge independently of the question you ask of it. That's, of course, very reminiscent of what's going on in quantum mechanics. It's also not an accident that, quantum mechanics is the place where all of these questions about subject and object and disentangling subject and object arise. So exactly the same problem in some ways of understanding how the logic of the relationship between subject and object, in order for there to be something that is a potential object of knowledge, in a way presupposes that you can stabilize it independently of the questions that you ask about. So I think there again, it's not an accident that this is interference of some kind that doesn't yield to the ordinary ways of understanding interference.
Thank you.
Okay, so there is time for one very small question if someone wants to ask. Otherwise, I guess we can just thank again Jenann. Thanks a lot.
Thank you everybody. This was really fun.
Great talk. Thank you a lot. So that's we're gonna meet next week.
Bye. Thank you all.
Ciao Mauro.
Ciao.
See you next week.
Bye, thank you very much.
Ci vediamo settimana prossima, Dustin.
Sì.